It is an honor to welcome back on this year's Associated Student Speakers Program, Mr. Lomax. I am sure many of you will remember the debate between Mr. Lomax and Mr. William Buckley Jr. last semester. Besides his weekly television show, Mr. Lomax hosts a daily 2-hour radio program. He is also the author of 3 popular books entitled The Reluctant African, The Negro Revolt, and When the Word is Given. Instead of having our coffee hour as usual in the men's lounge following the presentation, there will be a question and answer period immediately following Mr. Lomax's speech here in the Grand Ballroom. So at this time, it is indeed an honor and privilege to be able to present to you today Mr. Louis Lomax. Thank you.
Thank you. It appears that every time I am scheduled at UCLA, I have trouble with my throat. I don't know whether I am allergic to the campus or the campus is allergic to me. But in either eventuality, I beg your indulgence, because the issue I shall attempt to deal with today, I feel to be one of profound importance, and it may well be the issue you as young people must deal with as you move into your proper places as the establishment. Nothing, I suspect, is more frightening to a young lady from UCLA walking around in a pair of slacks, sandals, her hair hanging off her shoulders, and a picket sign, than to suddenly realize that one day she indeed will be president of the PTA. But alas, and indeed, it is true. And it is for that moment, I think, that we must think. When this lecture was scheduled some several months ago, it was suggested and agreed upon that I would discuss the Negro Revolt revisited. And in a sense, I will do that. But with your leave, I would like to place the current status of the Negro Revolution in the broad context where I believe it accurately and properly belongs. Rather than let me take the occasion of this convocation to raise a voice of protest and a voice of dissent concerning the theology of Americanism, which is now sweeping this country. A theology that we are not only falling victim to ourselves, but already in the person of Henry Cabot Lodge and God knows how many others, we are beginning now to send missionaries of this new field of theology abroad to convert the heathens in other lands. I am disturbed by the theology of Americanism because in reality it is a theology of fear. A theology which would command and commit the deepest emotions of us all. A theology that springs from the dark and dank and dirty well of the frightened and the insane, rather than a theology that springs from the clear running spring of people, as a democratic people must be, who are imbued with the notion of hope and with some element, and I think justifiably so, of optimism. This theology of Americanism, like all theologies, has its hegemony, its gods, its devils, its saints, its angels. And I'm frightened first by this theology of Americanism because of this array of saints and devils. Because it is in this theology of chauvinistic Americanism that suddenly God becomes laissez-faire capitalism. The risen Christ becomes rugged individualism. The devil, of course, is communism. And the Holy Ghost becomes a little old candy maker from Belmont, Massachusetts. And I, for one, am appalled and shocked that more and more the voices that once used to be clear, lucid, resolute, are being droned out by those men who espouse not only crooked logic, but an even more unbelievable kind of ethical position. Now, what is this theology of Americanism that I am talking about? It is the theology that commits us to the proposition that we are right. Therefore, whatever we do is right, and therefore whatever anyone does in opposition to us is ipso facto wrong. And the end result then, you get someone who will walk up to you and he wants to discuss the situation in Vietnam, and I reply, as I do twice a week now on my television program, I think we're wrong in Vietnam. And he will look at me and cloud up, and you can hear the Star-Spangled Banner as the fire, And he will shake his finger and he will say, well, why don't you support our fighting men in Vietnam? I said, I am, baby. I'm supporting them because I'm trying to get them back home alive. But the logic is that to support your fighting men in Vietnam, you must commit yourself to war in Vietnam. And it is this blind theology of Americanism which says you don't question, you don't think. LBJ has already arrived at a Johnsonian consensus, and yours is not to ask or wonder why. Yours is but to say yes, and if necessary, to go and to die. And I'm frightened by this theology of Americanism, because it commits us not only to what I believe is thoroughly an unjust war, but it has committed us to a totally unjust foreign policy. Somebody said the other day in a shocking statement, if we must pull out of Vietnam, then we'll simply put our troops into Thailand. In other words, we've got our next Vietnam already picked out, and I wonder how many millions will it cost us to bribe the head of the government of Thailand to invite us in so we can begin on the amazing premise that we've been invited in by a government under the threat of communism, you see. And I'm frightened by this theology of Americanism, which is really the last legacy of John Foster Dulles, this theology of Americanism, which has committed us to ruthless chauvinism over all of the world. And I am frightened by this theology of Americanism because it draws our attention away from the roots, from the causes of modern problems, and illusions us into believing that all it takes to solve modern problems is the show of American force with the contingents of McNamara, going forth into all of the world. And one hears this shrieking cry that, of course, we must stem the flow, the tide of conquering communism. Well, you get no big arguments out of me on that. But one does raise the question, how? How, Mr. Buckley, do you win the battle? You certainly don't win it with Joe Pyne marching at the head of the moral forces in Los Angeles. You don't win it by dropping bombs on people's heads and putting napalm on their bodies. For if there is a battle, and I submit that there is, the battle is for the minds of the uncommitted peoples of the world. Now go home tonight and in your dormitories, pull down the map and draw a circle around the committed peoples of the world, and now we'll see what the fight is about. And it suddenly becomes crystal clear that all of the white people of the world are committed. They're either communists or capitalists. Now, when we say that then the struggle is for the minds of the uncommitted people of the world, who then are the uncommitted people of the world? Me, baby, really. The black men of Africa, the light brown and black men of Latin America and the Caribbean, the yellow men of Asia. And it's in this theology of Americanism that we look at the problems of these people all over the world, including the problem of the American Negro, and that we are blinded and therefore we forget the historical roots of these problems. We only rise to the bait when the communists move in, and oftentimes then we find it is too late. How shocking, young men, those of you, some of you who probably will have to go forth and die before this thing is over, that we are stuck with the proposition, for example, in South Vietnam, of trying to convince a man that we are dying for him because we love him, and yet we have to swallow hard and be dry in our throats when he reminds us that he is the same yellow, slant-eyed man whom we have deliberately kept out of this country for 100 years by our immigration quota. How can you export that which you do not grow? How can you bring to South Vietnam that which you do not have yourselves? And one only hopes that after we will have supervised the election in Vietnam in September, we'll get back home to supervise it in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia in November. And it is precisely this moment of blindness, of not knowing that there are problems running through the world, the problems of poverty, the problems of hunger, the problems left over from colonialism, the problems left over from segregation. These are the issues before men, and men, young people, are not going to die and remain hungry simply to hold up our American theology and our American economic ideas. If our ideas are worth a damn, then let's make them work. And to the degree that capitalism feeds people, houses people, clothes people, and provides jobs for people, to that degree will capitalism be accepted and work throughout the world. But people are not going to swallow it simply because we say so. Our economy must become operative and effective, or it will fail. And it is in this theology of Americanism that we're not allowed to examine our economy. It becomes almost un-American to point out, when you look at the poor Negro in Watts, you look at the American rate of unemployment, the lowest in history, 3.1. For the American Negro, it's 3 times that, 9.5. But for the man and the people in Watts, the unemployment rate as of this morning is 37.9. The greatest depression in the history of Western civilization sits in the middle of Los Angeles, California. And so now everybody is down there with a pad and a pencil trying to ward off what they think might happen again this summer. And it's one of the funniest things to walk through Watts and see white reporters and sociologists and psychologists and psychiatrists running up and down the streets of Watts with a clipboard and a pencil, stopping every Negro they see, and walking up to him saying, "Pardon me, sir, how do you feel and why?" And now you see then the other frenetic end of the effort is everybody is running around to train the Negro in Watts, get his hands ready to do something. And of course, nobody has raised the fundamental question, what are you training him to be? What kind of skill or semi-skill are you giving him? Will the economy produce the job once he acquires the skill? And what are you going to do about the fact that within the next 15 years, as a result of automation, some 35% of us will be producing the goods consumed by the remainder of us. And this is exactly what I mean by this American theology, you see, because the American theology is rooted back in the old puritanical notion, which justifies capitalism, you see, that the laborer goes forth into the vineyard and he plucks some grapes, and for plucking the grapes he's given a few coins, and with the coins he buys wine, which creates a new market for grapes, which keeps him in a job as a grape plucker, you see, and the whole thing, this capitalistic wheel, keeps going over and over and over again. Well, it's a simplistic theory, and it's gotten complex because all of a sudden now, you see, the laborer doesn't go forth into the vineyard. A machine goes. Now, the machine can pluck the grapes, but the machine cannot buy, nor can it, thank God, drink the wine. Now, if I'm going to buy the wine, then you've got to give me money from somewhere. And even Barry Goldwater can no longer tell me that I'm poor because I'm lazy, when there simply are no more jobs to be had, and some 70% of us are looking at the other 30-odd% of you while you work. Then what do we do? And as it is being suggested all over, and somebody finally had enough of a lucid moment to say it in Lyndon Johnson's office one day, we are within 15 years of a guaranteed annual wage in this country. This is what I'm talking about, this economy thing, where we're going to have to give people money, and we can afford it, you see, for simply being alive. And if you're a Negro, you get a bonus for what's happened to you. And it is as we move into this new era, this dynamic moment of a new kind of economy, of a new kind of political outlook, where all of the peoples of the world, black and white, Jew and Gentile, the poor, the oppressed, the ones colonialized, are asserting themselves. It is then that this theology of Americanism must fail. Indeed, the theology of Americanism is nothing more than the power arm of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male status quo, and that is the God who's dead. And in the wake of this theology, there must emerge a new theology, I submit, of liberalism. But at the moment, we are caught in a web, in a sense, tighter than the web of the McCarthy era. And one shook his head as a writer and social critic during McCarthy's time. But even during McCarthy, never did I once see anything quite as tragic as the sight of great, intellectual, beautiful spirited Hubert Humphrey coming out for war. There's a tragedy in this. There's a tragedy when you look up and it suddenly becomes crystal clear that the principal leaders of the civil rights movement have literally been sucked in by the establishment. And suddenly it's clear that the way to do the thing is to, at least on paper, give the Negro everything the Negro says he wants, shut him up, and if you can make the Negro be quiet, then you successfully silence one of the two voices of protest left in this country. And the tragedy of the civil rights movement at the moment is that it is being sucked in by an administration which is willing to make all kinds of paper decrees and paper concessions, but in return for silence. You want a fair housing bill? Swing in, Brother Wilkins, but I'll tell you what now. If I give it to you, let's don't have any talk about Negroes dying out of proportion to the numbers in Vietnam. Let's don't bring this up. And let's send out the word everywhere, all over the country, that everybody had better rally around the Johnsonian consensus. You want to vote? Okay, I'll get you registered in Alabama. No problem. But be quiet. In other words, be parochial in your views. And shut up. So long as it doesn't hurt your corn as a Negro, then be quiet. Don't talk about being an American. Don't act like you're free, because that's not true. You are instead a satisfied, placated Negro. You are not a free American who speaks out when he sees his country in philosophical and in moral turmoil. As one revisits the Negro Revolt, one is disturbed to find that the militancy is on the wane. The guts have all been fried out. But for a few bobtail kids in SNCC and a few in CORE, you suddenly realize that what has been pulled off in this country with respect to the Negro is essentially a middle-class revolution. A revolution that opened the chicken wire a little bit wider, and a few Negroes from what Du Bois used to call the talented 10th have been able to wiggle through the chicken wire and get on the other side and say, hallelujah, God praise integration. But you look back and you suddenly realize that whereas the struggle of the past 10 years has created more opportunities for the middle class Negro, the plight of the Negro masses is worse today than it was in 1954. The Negro Revolt has not spoken to the root of the problem. Rather, it has been a middle-class revolution. And this is why the phenomenon of Watts last summer was directed as much against the middle-class Negro as it was the white man. Watts, I submit, was not racial, it was class. What did Spengler say in The Decline of the West? He predicted that ultimately the American race problem would dissolve into a class problem, and this is precisely where we are today. And it's so amazing because it runs so deep in this theology of Americanism to see frenetic efforts by industry. Everybody now, out to find a Negro to put in residence. Everybody wants a Negro to sit by the front door to do something to get him off the hook. There's hardly a day that my phone doesn't ring at the studio from some big white businessman wanting me to find him an instant Negro to fill a job. And this is this class thing that I'm talking about. I got a call the other day from the president of a bank. And he said, Mr. Lomax, I've seen your program. I like it. I said, thank you. He says, listen, there is an opening for a vice president in my bank. And I looked at my wife and drew up because I knew what was coming next. He says, now I want you to find me a Negro. Now he must be qualified, of course. But I've decided to hire a Negro to be vice president of my bank. So I said, how many Negro tellers do you have in your bank? He said, none. How many Negro accountants do you have in your bank? None. How many Negro clerks do you have in your bank? None. How many Negro secretaries do you have in your bank? None. How many Negro janitors do you have in your bank? He said, none. Have you ever in life hired a Negro? No. Now here's a man who's been running a bank for 29 years and never hired a Negro even to sweep a floor. Now he wants me to come up with a Negro who is qualified to be vice president of his bank. And as I said to him, and I meant it with all of the levity involved, I said, look, sir, you looking for Negroes? We got plenty of them. We've got tall Negroes, short Negroes, fat Negroes, slim Negroes, light Negroes, dark Negroes, but super Negroes we do not have, you see. The point that I make is that we have created a class clash in this country by denying a major segment of this country an opportunity to learn how to play the American game. And so here you are in the position of keeping a man in slavery and in segregation, not even letting him sweep the floor of a bank. Then all of a sudden you expect him to be qualified to be president of the bank. And I wound up by saying to the bank president, I said, well, the only way I can advise you to get what you're looking for is to go out, and this is exactly what I said, to UCLA, where you get all these stupid young white boys, and get yourself some stupid young Negro boys, and give them 15 years of the same training you give these stupid white boys, and by that time you'll have a stupid Negro who will be dumb enough to be vice president of your bank. I mean, there's no mystery, you see, to the process. But it is, and this is the reason of my fear, this theology of Americanism, this creation of this class conflict, which I think is going to bring us low if it is not resolved. And I've discussed it in terms of our foreign policy. I've discussed it in terms of our domestic economy. I've discussed it in terms of the civil rights movement, because I think the civil rights movement is on the verge of being captured by this theology of conservatism. And finally, I'm disturbed by this theology of conservatism because of what it will do to one's spirit, to one's intellect. After all, what is man? If he is indeed higher than the animals, lower than the angels, and the thing that distinguishes man, obviously, is his mind, his ability to think, his ability to reason, his almost determined efforts to raise the critical questions about himself, with himself. But under this theology of Americanism, this theology of fear, one wakes up and salutes the flag. One gets a lump in one's throat. Then one prays, of course. Then one says a few words for motherhood, of course. Then one polishes off his bumper sticker to support his local police. And one drives to work dialing frenetically on the radio, trying to figure out what happened to the conservative speakers who were on K-Day, because you can't hear them anymore. And one arrives at work and one falls into a pattern of life. And one sends one's daughter to school, and as a woman said to me, St. Mary College in Minneapolis 3 weeks ago after I lectured, one of the parents was sitting in the back of the room, and she got up and she said, "Mr. Lomax, you shouldn't say these kinds of things to these young students." And I said, "Why, madam?" She said, "Because my daughter is in this audience, and I don't want my daughter to hear these ideas. I sent my daughter to college to have her convictions reinforced." How many times and how many ways have you young people heard this? Conform. Conform. Come back home with all of the idiocy you had when you left. But this time, be sophisticated with it. Have it reinforced. Don't question it. Like the instant Negro, you come home with instant intelligence. Don't protest. Don't raise the ultimate questions about life, about man, about God, and above all, about your own country and about your own economy. So just one fears, as they have in many instances engulfed the Negro Revolt. One fears, and this is the last voice of protest now, that the student movement in this country is under siege. You're dirty, amoral, communist, Bettina Aptheker's all, un-Christian in that you will not cut your hair, un-American in that you wear sandals, and of course it's downright ungodly that you carry a sign that raises an embarrassing question. So the move comes again, quiet them down. Nowhere shall there be voices raised voices of disturbing protest. And I'm saying to you this morning that it's going to be only to the degree that healthy dissent is kept alive in this country, that this country will indeed be fit to be kept alive. We of this country, young people, are not God Almighty, and let's quit confusing ourselves with God Almighty. We are in the process of correcting many of the evils of history, but we are still involved in some of the ugliest evils of the present. Look this moment at South Africa, where 12.5 million people are being kept in a state of almost slavery by 3 million people. All right, America, if you're God Almighty, what is your position, American God, on that? Well, we don't like it, and we'll wrap their white knuckles in the UN, but whose guns are those they're using to shoot blacks? Well, NATO's. Well, who's NATO? Us. And where did the guns come from? For Sharpeville and the tanks? Well, we gave it to them, but we didn't know they were going to do that with them. Well, Mr. White American God, how about these gold mines, these diamond mines in South Africa, where black men work for 40 cents a day and are in many instances chained to their beds at night? Who owns that? Well, the American government doesn't. The Chase Manhattan Bank. Well, is there a major difference? And Mr. Rockefeller, you see, as you're going about the nation, not only being the governor of New York and building schools for Negroes, how do you account for the fact, Mr. Nelson Rockefeller, that your family fortune is rooted in the diamond and the gold mines of the Congo and of South Africa? But it's all right, you see. So long as white Christians oppress black Christians and black heathens in South Africa, the Theology of Americanism says it's all right, just as St. Paul said in the New Testament, slaves, obey your master in the Lord. But the moment the communists move in, then we'll act. Indeed, when this thing happened in southern Rhodesia and the white minority took over, I could not help but laugh, because if the white minority that took over had been communists, why, McNamara would have led the forces himself. We would have found some pretense to land in Rhodesia by 9:30 the following morning, and we would have sworn that we went in to set black men free. Well, nonsense. You see, we went in out of this incredible American theology. And the point that I prosecute is that maybe we're fooling ourselves, but we are not fooling the world. We're going to have to come out of Vietnam, young people. One day, whether we like it or not, the Vietnamese, and I know this is strange to say, but the Vietnamese must vote and rule their own country. And even the State Department has admitted that given the opportunity to vote, particularly nationwide, the people of Vietnam would elect their George Washington, Ho Chi Minh. Well, if in a free election they are going to vote for the very man whom we say is a communist, what are you dying about? To stop the very thing you admit they're going to do once they go to the polls. But in a deeper sense, what does all of this say about us as a people and us as a nation? We've bought off the Negro. We're buying off the students. And the new mavericks of all people become William Fulbright and Richard Russell. And here we are in Vietnam ostensibly defending communism, but here we are knee-deep in the murky gold mines and the diamond mines of Africa. Here we are not making the demands on Rhodesia that we know we should make. Here we are not doing the things we know we should do deep in our own South. Here we are, by their own admission, living in California with a town like Glendale with a gentleman's agreement that not only excludes Negroes, but cuts the line very thin when it comes to a Jew. And so you read the heroic story of a Negro from Washington, D.C., who sees the live grenade as it's about to explode, and he throws his body on it to save his comrades, most of whom are white, and everybody says to that black hero, let's build a monument. Well, the greatest monument would be to move his mother and father into a house in Glendale. The world is tired, I think, of these monuments which take the form of steeples, fountains, and churches and buildings. People want more and more the kinds of monuments which are functional in the lives of individuals, producing food, housing, clothing, shelter, and in the midst of it all, producing justice. One concludes then by beckoning your young minds away from the theology of Americanism, away from the gospel of fear, urging rather that you participate in the making of a new kind of society, in the formation of the American ethos, which is just now beginning to define itself. For we in America are a new thing, and we are now only beginning to emerge. But as we emerge, we shall emerge with a new view of races, a new view of religions, a new view, I think, of the meaning of democracy. Most of all, a new philosophy of man. One beckons you away from the gospel of fear, because the gospel of fear commits the ultimate sin of being afraid of the free spirit of man. And it assumes that man collectively is evil. And I urge that man collectively is good. And so everyone makes his own kind of commitment. And I, for one, believe in man because I am man, and I refuse to disbelieve in me. Rather, in the words of William Faulkner, we must remain free, reassert our faith in man, because man not only will endure, he will prevail.
There will be a very short intermission before we have our question and answer period, and all those remaining for the question and answer period, please come up to the front. That was just...
Right ahead. Wait a minute, that isn't true. You're reading the primitive form. Negro stores were. Sure, why don't we... Now what happened in Harlem? You see, you want to convict and reinforce. So. Could you tell me in Harlem, the year before, the stores, white stores were having Negroes or not? That is also. What did you think? Yeah, because of the truth. All you have to do is go and watch the road. Many Negro stores were burnt. This is my point about getting the conviction reinforced. You're getting them out of what you want to believe. Because if you have to read in the paper, in the local papers, most of it is just plain lie. And in the Eastern papers also, in the New York Times.
Why don't we finish off this first question? I mean, I'll take our seats and we'll begin with this very same point. Okay.
Again, you know, you fall victim of reading Paul Coates and listening to John Roosevelt. And that just isn't true. What did happen is simply this. I was hired by a radio station that most people never heard of, called K-Day, K-D-A-Y, 1580 on your dial. And I worked, and this is partially why I'm ill now, I worked for 3 months. You wouldn't believe what we put into it. On the air, live, 2 hours a day, 6 days a week. The station was so insignificant that every month when the radio rating sheets were published, it didn't even appear on the page. After 2.5 months, we finally got at the bottom of the page, and we're beginning to crawl up the page. And the survey showed finally that somewhere between 12 and 2 o'clock every day, I had upwards of 1 million people listening. Now, once this was announced, Mr. Lewis, that same great late endower of institutions, the man who will give Pepperdine College $1 million if Pepperdine will give Dan Smoot a doctorate. This Mr. Lewis decided, looky. Nobody else will put my 5 programs a week on the air. So he goes to K-Day, and he says, I want 5 programs a week, 15 minutes a day. I want to tag on. Now this is the key. I want to tag on to Lomax. I want his audience. So we'll put Dan Smoot on Monday. We'll put Donald Jackson on Tuesday. We'll put Billy James Hargis on Wednesday. We'll put the John Birch Society on Friday. And I'm trying to remember who the 5th one was. It was Smoot, Hargis, Donald Jackson, the John Birch Society. It'll come to him in a moment, a notorious one. So the station, in a moment of total insensitivity, because after all, the station is licensed to serve the Negro community, and putting Billy James Hargis, Dan Smoot, and Dean Clarence Mannion, putting these men on a station licensed to serve the Negro community is like putting George Lincoln Rockwell on a station licensed to serve the Jewish community. But they're going to hook onto my coattail because of the audience I built. And this was the contract. This is the way they bought it. Fine. Now what I did is this. I said, now I am to this station a $25,000 a year liability. This is what they pay me. And my program as of yet is not sponsored. The Dr. Ross dog food people walked in with $10,000 for every 13 weeks. So they are a distinct economic asset. I am a distinct economic liability. So I went on the air and I told the management what I was going to do. I said, now these men have the right to speak. You have the right to sell them the time. I have the right not to create an audience for their filth and their hate. In other words, I have the right to quit. And at the end of my contract, which is 9 weeks from now, I'm going to quit. That's what I did. The station then said, we made a mistake in putting these people on. The station put them off. As of this moment, I have not rescinded my resignation. Yes, sir. He is. I would watch this phrase you used about him not being accepted by the white world. There is now created a very integrated world where he is accepted. He is not accepted in the big money circles. Yeah, I'll buy this. I'll buy this. But the middle-class Negro does find a measure of comfort and security, and integrated comfort and security at that, if this is what he wants, in this little new world. I think the middle-class Negro is going to identify with, I think he's going to swallow on the whole the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle-class ethic. That's what I think he's going to do. I think he already has. I think in many instances he's sympathetic to the Negro masses, but he is across the gulf from them and he can't talk to them. And even when he tries to talk to them, he meets with hostility and he can't talk to them. I don't think of myself, well, in terms of income, I guess I'm middle class, but in terms of my attitudes, I suspect, on the whole, they're pretty much lower class in terms of their revolutionary roots. But I can give you a classic example of how rough this thing is. As you remember, the Watts thing of last August burned down most of the stores and all of the drugstores. Now, on my television program that Sunday night, I issued a plea for food. I single-handedly was able to round up 85 van loads of food and had them brought to a church in Watts. And Mrs. Lomax and I stood in front of that church from 8 o'clock Monday morning until 4:30 that afternoon, passing out food. About 12:30, it became evident that many babies were sick for lack of Similac, is it called? Something to feed the babies, and many heart patients, no medicine. I went to a phone booth and called Schwab's drugstore up here in Sunset, where I have an account, and they sent out $1,900 worth of drugs on my bill. In fact, Mr. Lomax and I are planning a party next month to pay off the last $500 of it. But now wait, I want to tell you what happened. Now here we were all day long standing there, giving out food, going in debt, and toward the end, about 3 o'clock, a lady walked up to Mrs. Lomax and me. She was in line, and she looked at me and she shook her finger. She says, "You think you different because you on television. You's just another nigger. Give me some milk." Now, see, how do you deal with this? You see, you need more than Sociology 101 to figure out what this is all about. And this is what we've got to solve. And it was nothing to do but give that good sister some milk, you see. Because she not only she needed it, but she was twisting at the thing that pains us in this nation, this thing that I'm talking about. And I think this is the kind of task to which we're going to have to commit ourselves. And I think the middle-class Negro, on the whole, is going to buy the system. He is going to be as upset by automation, by the guaranteed annual wage, as will the middle-class white man. He will not be able to make a shift in his values. I wish he would, but I don't think he's going to make it. You've read Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie. Okay, well then, as you know, Franklin saw it. Yes, sir. You mean by the poverty people? I mean the people who had been elected? the 7, at the moment of the rehiring of Opal Jones. Is that what you're talking about? This specific? I don't know all the details. I do know all of the people on the board who were elected from the poverty areas, and I've talked to one or two of them. And from what I can gather, they were walking out not in protest of the re-election of Mrs. Jones, the rehiring of Mrs. Jones, but rather at the fact that they simply are impotent. They have no power whatsoever. It's a question of 17 against 7, and it was this that they were protesting. But I don't know any further details.
Time for one more question.
Yes, sir. Right here. Go right ahead. Go right ahead. You're on. Well, Martin and I have disagreed on various things through the years. I mean, we grew up together as children. He's one of my closest friends, and I totally am with him in terms of philosophy. And, and he calls me up and say, Louis, like, I need you to go to jail. And I say, well, can you hold it off till tomorrow and get, till I can make 50 cents first. But from time to time, I have disagreed with him on tactical positions. I think, strangely enough, I think perhaps Martin's greatest mistake was a philosophical mistake, but one that he had to make because he is the kind of committed man he is. I think perhaps his greatest mistake was in giving white people the overall impressions that Negroes loved them. And I think white people needed to believe this anyway. This image of a man with his foot on his neck looking down and saying, you love me, don't you, boy? Well, hell no, why should I? And this thing has been spread abroad, and I think the twin dangers. One is when a Negro spokesman becomes a fear-monger, one who runs around and says, well, if you don't do this, there's going to be a riot next Monday at 4:30. And the other one is the guy who says, well, all Negroes love you, because I think each of them commits the same sin, and that you don't tell the truth. And it seems to me that the truth is of utter importance when you're trying to pull off the kind of uneasy revolution the Negro is pulling off in this country. And I think many white people, and this was the key positive result of the Watts riot, that white people for the first time found out Negroes were really frustrated and mad and didn't like them. And many of them were saying, in essence, well, why didn't somebody tell us? We thought everything was, approximately cool. Nobody told us, and most white people in Los Angeles can say with all honesty that they don't have any real deep-seated old-fashioned prejudice that, and it just never occurred to them that Watts was Watts and this thing was this way, and the people felt like people are feeling. And so I have disagreed with Martin in making the point of saying over and over and over and over, we love you, even though you kick us, we love you, because this isn't true. And it might trick you into kicking me one time too many. Then I might do something that all of us will regret, you see, for the remainder of our lives. Okay, we'll discriminate and have the last one with you. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can start by firing Chief Parker. This is, in other words, the hate that you get from Watts, you don't get it from me. The hate that you get from Watts is a reaction to the symbols of power in this town. Specifically, it's a reaction to Chief Parker. It's a reaction to Mayor Yorty. It's a reaction to the same kind of sleazy selfish, opportunistic politics that says we don't have sense enough to go to the county museum and look at the back seat of a 38 Dodge, regardless of what's happening on it. And if you notice, the same people who didn't want you to see the Coinets exhibit at the museum were the same people who are attacking relief, who are leading the fight to destroy the Mars program. These kinds of attitudes come in clusters. So what we really need, if indeed a large segment of the white population wants to be felt and heard, is a political miracle. We need a Lindsay, a new breath of political freedom that will give people a sense of hope. So I think it not only involves the firing of Chief Parker, I know it involves the defeat of Mayor Yorty. Let me take this a little bit deeper. 3 weeks ago, Sunday night, on my Sunday night television program, I was interviewing the man who's speaking out front today, Lord Hampton. And in the process of the interview, I said, okay, will you support Yorty if Yorty is a Democratic nominee? He says, yes. And I told him, I said, do you realize that Yorty is a man who's completely lost confidence of the minorities, that Yorty campaigned in the Negro community and won, and therefore won the election by promising to fire Parker. And he hand mumbled something, and I wasn't after him, so I let him go. Something very interesting happened. All tarnation broke loose in the Yorty office the next day, ringing up the station. They were after my scalp. So the station said, in essence, well, come on down and answer Lomax. He's been trying to, no, we don't want to come near Lomax. We've been trying to get him in the hot seat for a year. Now, this is very interesting. The Yorty insisted, so the station said, okay, Your Honor, what do you want to do? He says, send a camera down here, and I'll read my statement on film, and you put it in the Lomax show next week. Fine. So he read a 4-minute statement. They taped the thing with me saying, we'll now have a few words from Mayor Yorty about Chief Parker. Stuck it all together, put it in the middle of the program. Now, the thing he objected to was my comment about him promising to fire Parker. In his reply, and this is what I mean by dishonesty, and I hope you'll print it like I said. In his reply, he never once mentioned the thing he complained about, because he knows very well he did it. Rather, he went on to talk about the virtues of Chief Parker. Then he reaches into his briefcase, he takes out a letter from Brody, perhaps the most distinguished Negro judge in town. He says, I want to show you. And he reads this letter from Brody, in which Brody is writing Yorty, congratulating Yorty from the way Yorty handles it on the excellent work of Chief Parker. And then, of course, most of his reply is given over to attacking Governor Brown. Now, what happens the next day? The phone rings, it's Judge Brody. 1, the letter was written 4 years ago. 2, it was a private, not a public communication. 3, it was not a general approval of Parker, but an approval of one specific thing Parker had done. And 4, Brody does not want his name used after all he is a Brown appointee in connection with Yorty's efforts to unseat Brown. Now I'm in the position of giving Brody equal time to say he didn't say what Yorty said he said, and here we go all over again. But it is this insidious half-truth. This is this theology of fear, young people, and I hope you're aware of this thing, how they do it. It's a theology of innuendo, a theology of fear, you see. As one man said to me the other day, he says, do you read Ramparts magazine? I said, yes. He said, sometimes they get to the left, don't they? I said, yes. And he said, and isn't it true you used to write for it? Yes. Now, what does that mean? It means Lomax is to the left. That's what it really means. It's this theology of innuendo, you see, this theology of fear. And it is this thing that you of free spirits and good minds must rise up and attack. See you on the picket line.